The birds had stopped singing 3 days before the ambassadors arrived. No one noted it in any official record. It was the kind of thing only peasants noticed. The sudden quiet in the trees along the road from Targovishte. The way the crows had moved south without reason. The way even the dogs in the villages had stopped barking at night. Something had shifted in the air above Wallachia, and every living thing that could leave had already made the decision. The ambassadors had not. They came from the Ottoman court, 2 men whose names history would record only in passing, carrying letters of demand wrapped in silk and sealed with wax the color of dried blood. They rode through the Carpathian passes as men who had done this before, certain of their authority, certain of the weight their letters carried. They had delivered demands to kings. They had stood before the most powerful men in Europe and watched those men lower their eyes. Wallachia was a small principality. Its prince was, by all accounts, unstable. This would not take long. The forest watched them come. It had watched armies come and go for centuries. Roman legions, Magyar horsemen, waves of Mongol cavalry that crested the horizon and broke against the mountains like water against stone. The Carpathians remembered everything. They kept their records in fallen trees and frozen soil, in the bones of men who had miscalculated the season, the distance, or the man waiting at the end of the road. The forest did not judge. It simply remembered. The ambassadors reached the court at dusk. They were received with unexpected formality. Torches lit along the entrance, servants in clean livery, the smell of wood, smoke, and roasting meat drifting from somewhere inside the walls. The prince, they were told, was expecting them. He had been expecting them, in fact, for some time. Vlad III, son of Vlad the Dracula, heir to the house of Draculishti, ruling Prince of Wallachia for the 2nd time, sat at the head of a long table when they entered. He was 33 years old. He was not a large man. He had his father's dark eyes and something else beneath them, a quality that the ambassadors would have struggled to name had they been given the opportunity to struggle with anything afterward. It was patience. Not the patience of a man who was calm. The patience of a man who had already decided. They presented their turbans before him, a custom of the Ottoman court, a gesture of deference that also communicated rank, authority, and the power behind the letters they carried. Vlad looked at the turbans for a moment. He looked at the men. He asked them, very quietly, why they had not removed their hats in his presence. The ambassadors explained that they did not remove their turbans for any man. It was a religious custom. It was a matter of law. It was not something that had ever been questioned before. Vlad nodded slowly. He said he understood completely. He said that he would never ask them to abandon a custom they held so deeply. He said that, if anything, he admired their commitment to it. Then he had their turbans nailed to their heads. Not as an act of rage. That is the part that the accounts always struggle to convey. It was done methodically, almost ceremonially, with the same composed expression he had worn since they entered the room. The screaming, in the diplomatic reports that would eventually reach Constantinople, is described almost as an afterthought. What the reports dwell on, what they seem unable to move past, is that throughout the entire event, the prince did not raise his voice. He did not appear angry. He appeared satisfied. The way a man appears satisfied when something he has long anticipated has finally, exactly, gone according to plan. The ambassadors were released. Badly injured, deeply shaken, but alive, and that too was a decision. Dead men carry no message. Wounded men do. They would return to the Ottoman court, and deliver not only the letters they had failed to present, but something the Sultan had not asked for, a precise and vivid account of what waited for him in Wallachia. An account of a man who was not afraid, who had never been afraid, who had, if anything, been waiting for this moment since he was a child. And that is where the story actually begins. Not in this room, not with these ambassadors, not with the iron nails, or the screaming, or the composed expression of a prince who had made up his mind. It begins much earlier, in a different kind of darkness. The kind that is not made of violence, but of waiting, of years spent in a foreign court, learning the language of men who owned you, understanding slowly and completely that the world would never give you anything you did not take from it yourself. The forest along the road from Targovishte had stopped singing 3 days before the ambassadors arrived. It would not start again for a very long time. Wallachia was not a country in any sense that the great powers of Europe would have recognized. It was a corridor, a narrow band of territory pressed between the Carpathian Mountains to the north and the Danube River to the south, a geographic accident that had somehow survived long enough to develop a name, a language, and a recurring habit of burying its rulers before they grew old. To the west, the Kingdom of Hungary watched it with the possessive attention of a landlord who has not yet decided whether to collect rent or foreclose. To the east and south, the Ottoman Empire, the largest military force the world had seen since Rome, pressed against its borders the way a tide presses against a wall it knows, eventually, will give. Wallachia existed in the space between those two certainties. It had always existed there. And it had learned, over generations, that survival in such a space required a particular kind of ruler. Not a strong one, necessarily. Strength invited challenge. Not a wise one, in the conventional sense. Wisdom without leverage was simply a slower way to lose. What Wallachia needed, what it had always needed, was a ruler who understood the geometry of the trap it lived inside, and who could move within that geometry without being crushed by it. This was a skill that looked, from the outside, very much like treachery. From the inside it felt like breathing. Vlad's father had understood this. Vlad too, called Dracula, meaning dragon, for his membership in the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order founded to defend Christendom against the Ottoman advance, had spent his reign performing an exhausting diplomatic balancing act that required him to face in two directions simultaneously and convince both audiences that he was facing only them. He paid tribute to the Ottomans. He pledged loyalty to Hungary. He sent soldiers to both sides of conflicts, sometimes in the same season. He was not a coward. He was a man who had looked at the map of his world with complete honesty and made his calculations accordingly. The Ottomans appreciated him, in the way that large powers appreciate small ones that cause no trouble. The Hungarians tolerated him, in the way that patrons tolerate clients who are useful but not essential. His own boyars, the Wallachian nobility, a class of men whose loyalty was primarily to their own land and their own survival, watched him with the careful attention of people who had seen princes come and go, and had learned to distinguish between those worth following and those worth waiting out. Wallachia's throne was not inherited in any stable sense. It was contested, repeatedly, by multiple branches of the ruling family, each with a claim, each with supporters, each with the patience of men who understood that patience was the only currency that never devalued. A prince who ruled for a decade was considered fortunate. A prince who died in his bed was considered remarkable. Vlad too did not die in his bed. But that comes later. Before the ending, there is the decision that made everything else possible, or perhaps inevitable. In 1442, under pressure from the Ottoman Sultan Murad II, Vlad Dracula made an arrangement that every diplomatic record of the period treats as routine and every personal account treats as something else entirely. He sent 2 of his sons to the Ottoman court as hostages. Proof of loyalty. Collateral, in the most literal sense, human collateral, held against the possibility that Wallachia might decide, in some moment of religious fervor or Hungarian persuasion, to stop being cooperative. The boys were Vlad, who was 11 or 12, and Radu, who was younger still. They would not return for years. And when one of them finally did, he was no longer the same person who had left. The Ottoman court at Edirne was not a prison technically. The hostages of powerful families were housed well, educated carefully, treated with a formal courtesy that acknowledged their status while making their situation unmistakable. They learned Turkish. They studied military strategy, administration, the philosophy and theology of a world that was not their own. They were surrounded by wealth and power, and the constant, ambient awareness that none of it was available to them, that they were guests in the specific sense of the word that means you may not leave. Radu adapted. He was younger, more flexible, perhaps more willing to find comfort in the world as it was rather than the world he had been taken from. He learned to move within the Ottoman court with genuine ease. He became, over time, genuinely Ottoman, in preference, in alliance, in the deepest sense of belonging to a place. He was called Radu the Handsome. He was liked. He was safe. Vlad was not safe. Not in the same way. He learned the same language, studied the same texts, walked the same corridors, but something in him remained oriented toward a home he was no longer certain existed. He watched the way the Ottoman court operated. He watched how power moved through it, how decisions were made, how loyalty was enforced, how punishment functioned, not merely as consequence, but as communication. How a display of force, precisely calibrated and strategically timed, could accomplish in an afternoon what negotiation could not accomplish in a year. He was an attentive student. He studied everything. He stored it all. News from Wallachia arrived slowly, filtered through intermediaries who had their own reasons for what they chose to include and what they quietly omitted. There were reports of his father's continued reign. There were reports of shifting alliances, of Hungarian pressure, of the endless chess game that Wallachian politics had always been. And then, in 1447, there were no more reports from his father at all. Because his father was dead, killed, along with Vlad's older brother Mircea, in a political coup orchestrated by the Wallachian boyars in collaboration with John Hunyadi of Hungary, the man who would become one of the most powerful figures in the Christian resistance to Ottoman expansion. Mircea had been buried alive by some accounts. By others, simply beaten and thrown into a ditch. The accounts disagree on the method. They agree on the result. Vlad received this information in the Ottoman court. He was 15, or perhaps 16. He sat with it for a long time. The Ottomans watched him with interest. They were curious, perhaps, about what a boy does when he learns that the world has taken everything he was promised and replaced it with nothing but the knowledge that promises are made by the living and kept, if at all, only by the very dangerous. He did not grieve visibly. He did not appeal to his captors for help or comfort. He continued his studies. He continued to observe. He continued, in the way that certain people do when they have decided that the present moment is simply a period of preparation for something they have not yet been given the means to do, to wait. The forest along the road from Targovishte remembered a boy leaving. It did not yet know what would come back. He came back to Wallachia in 1448 with an Ottoman escort and a claim to a throne that belonged, at that moment, to someone else. The first reign lasted 2 months, possibly less. The historical record is imprecise, the way records tend to be when the events in question happen too fast for anyone to write them down carefully. What is known is that Vlad took the throne, held it briefly, and then lost it. Forced out by John Hunyadi, the same Hungarian warlord who had arranged his father's death. He fled east, into Moldavia, into the court of a cousin who tolerated his presence without committing to his cause. He was 17 years old. He had lost his father, his brother, and his throne within the span of a single year. Most men, at that point, would have found a smaller life to live. Vlad was not most men. He had learnt something in the Ottoman court that the boyars of Wallachia had not yet understood about him. He had learned that waiting was not the same as accepting. That stillness, in the right hands, was a form of pressure. The years in Moldavia, and later in Transylvania, under Hungarian protection of all arrangements, were years of watching and recalculating. Hunyadi, the man who had killed his father, eventually found it useful to support him. This was not a contradiction in Wallachian politics. It was simply how the game was played. Vlad accepted the support without forgetting its source. He studied Hunyadi's military methods. He observed how the Hungarians administered territory, how they built loyalty, how they punished defection. He stored all of it. In 1456, Hunyadi died of plague after a military campaign against the Ottomans. The balance of power in the region shifted slightly, briefly, in the way that balances do when a heavy weight is suddenly removed. And Vlad moved, precisely and without hesitation, into the space that had opened. He took the throne of Wallachia for the second time. He was 24 or 25 years old, and this time he had no intention of being removed. The boyars understood within weeks that something had changed. The man who had returned was not the boy who had left for the Ottoman court a decade earlier. He was quieter than they expected, more deliberate. He asked careful questions about land, about loyalty, about which families had supported which claimants during the years of his absence. He listened to the answers with an attention that some found flattering and others found deeply unsettling. The unsettled ones, it turned out, were reading the situation more accurately. What happened next entered the historical record from multiple directions simultaneously: Ottoman chronicles, Saxon merchant reports, Hungarian diplomatic correspondence, and later, German pamphlets that would spread across Europe with the speed and appetite of fire. The details vary. The outline does not. Vlad invited the boyars, the old families, the ones who had survived by switching sides, the ones whose loyalty was a calculation rather than a conviction, to a feast. It was Easter. The timing was deliberate. Everything, from this point forward, was deliberate. Those who could not answer how many princes they had known in their lifetimes, those whose number was too high, whose survival too convenient, were taken from the table. Some were impaled on the hill outside the city. Others were marched, still in their feast clothes, to the ruins of a castle in the mountains and told to build. They built until they could no longer stand. And then they built some more. The castle was Puanari. It still stands. The forest around it has grown back completely, as forests do. It keeps its own record of what happened there, in the way that places keep records, not in words, but in silence. in the particular quality of the quiet that settles over certain stones after enough time has passed. Wallachia noticed. The remaining boyars noticed most of all. And in the noticing, something shifted. The slow, reluctant recalibration of men who had always assumed that princes were temporary, and that they, the landowners, the survivors, were the permanent thing. Vlad was suggesting, through methods that required no explanation, that this assumption needed revision. Order, in Wallachia, had always been a negotiation between prince and boyar, between crown and church, between the weight of Ottoman demand and the pressure of Hungarian expectation. Every law was a compromise. Every boundary was provisional. The roads were dangerous, the merchants were cautious, and crime in the rural territories was less a problem to be solved than a condition to be managed, like weather, like flood, like the annual uncertainty of harvest. People had learned to live inside that uncertainty the way they learned to live inside the cold. By adjusting, by accepting, by looking away. Vlad did not look away. The accounts from this period, and there are many, arriving from directions that had no reason to agree with each other, describe a principality that changed texture almost overnight. Merchants who had paid bribes for decades to move goods along Wallachian roads stopped paying them. Not because the demand disappeared, but because the men who had collected the bribes disappeared first. Thieves who had operated in the forests along the trade routes made different calculations about the risk involved, and, in significant numbers, found other occupations. A golden cup, by one account, possibly embellished, certainly memorable, was placed at a public fountain in Targoviste, and left there, untouched, for the duration of Vlad's reign. No one took it. Everyone understood why. This was not law enforcement in any conventional sense. It was communication. Vlad had understood, in the Ottoman court and in the years of exile that followed, that law without consequence was simply suggestion. And that consequence, to be effective, did not need to be common. It needed to be certain. It needed to be visible. And it needed to be, in its nature, the kind of thing that people could not stop themselves from describing to others. The method he preferred for this communication was impalement. It was not, as later accounts would sometimes imply, an invention of his own imagination. It was a form of execution used across the region, including by the Ottomans, whose court had shaped him. But Vlad applied it with a consistency and a scale that transformed it from punishment into policy. The stakes were of varying heights, a detail that the sources note with a kind of horrified precision, because rank, even in death, was acknowledged. Nobility died higher than commoners. Foreign dignitaries higher still. There was a logic to it. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. Saxon merchants from Transylvania were among the first to experience this logic from the outside. They had long held trading privileges in Wallachia, agreements negotiated over generations that gave them preferential access to Wallachian markets, while limiting what Wallachian merchants could do in return. Vlad reviewed these agreements and found them unsatisfactory. He requested renegotiation. The Saxons, accustomed to the accommodating posture of previous princes, declined. They continued trading on the old terms, through routes that bypassed Vlad's new restrictions, with a confidence that had served them well for decades. It did not serve them now. The reprisals were documented in detail by the Saxons themselves. Letters sent to Transylvanian cities, to Hungarian officials, to anyone who might intervene. Villages burned. Merchants taken. Men impaled along the roads they had used to avoid paying duties. The letters are remarkable not only for what they describe, but for the tone in which they describe it. The genuine bewilderment of people who had mistaken a change of prince for a continuation of the same arrangement. They had not understood that the arrangement itself was what Vlad was ending. And yet Wallachia, in these same years, functioned. Trade moved differently, but it moved. The treasury filled. The roads became, by the standards of the era, unusually safe for those who operated within the rules Vlad had established. Foreign observers noted the paradox without resolving it. A principality governed by terror that was, by measurable indicators, more orderly than its neighbors. The cup at the fountain remained untouched. The forest watched the roads. And somewhere in the Carpathian passes, the merchants who had survived were already calculating whether what they had lost in the old arrangement was less than what they might gain in the new one. Most of them decided it was. That, too, was a form of communication. The Sultan had been patient. Murad, too, was dead by then. It was his son, Mehmed II, who now held the Ottoman throne. Mehmed, who had taken Constantinople in 1453 at the age of 21, who had ended the Byzantine Empire with a siege that Europe had believed, until the moment it happened, was impossible. He was not a man who accepted inconvenience from small principalities on his northern border. Wallachia owed tribute. It had always owed tribute. And for a time, under previous princes, that tribute had arrived reliably. Money, soldiers, the quiet cooperation of a vassal state that understood its position. Under Vlad, the tribute had stopped. Not reduced. Stopped. And the ambassadors sent to discuss the matter had returned, those who returned at all, with iron through their skulls and a story that spread through the Ottoman court like a fever. Mehmed sent a larger delegation. Vlad received them with the same composed attention he gave to everything, heard their demands, and had them imprisoned. He was not, he made clear, going to pay. He was not, he made equally clear, afraid of what that meant. What it meant was war. And Vlad had known that since before he stopped the tribute. The refusal was not a miscalculation. It was an opening move. He spent the months that followed preparing Wallachia for an Ottoman invasion with the methodical attention of a man who had studied military strategy since adolescence and had spent years inside the empire. He was now preparing to fight. He knew how Ottoman armies moved. He knew their supply lines, their communication patterns, the particular vulnerabilities of a force that was large enough to be nearly unstoppable and just large enough to be nearly impossible to feed. He knew that Wallachia could not defeat Mehmed in open battle. He had never intended to try. What he intended was something that had no clean name in the military vocabulary of the 15th century. He wrote to the King of Hungary, to the Pope, to every Christian power he could reach, describing what was coming and asking for support that he almost certainly knew would not arrive in time. The letters were not naive. They were documentation, a record created in advance of a man who had warned everyone and been left to face the consequences alone. There is something in the tone of those letters, preserved in archives in Brasov and Budapest and Rome, that reads less like a plea and more like an acknowledgement. He knew how this worked. He had always known. In the winter of 1461 and into 1462, Vlad crossed the Danube into Ottoman territory. He did not wait to be invaded. He moved first, striking at Ottoman positions along the southern bank with a speed and violence that the local commanders had not prepared for. He sent Mehmed a letter afterward, another document preserved in multiple archives, describing the campaign in precise detail. The numbers of dead, The towns taken. The territory covered. It was written in a tone of almost administrative calm, the way a man reports figures that he finds neither surprising nor troubling. It was also, unmistakably, a provocation. Mehmed gathered his army. It was, by contemporary estimates, enormous. 60,000 men, perhaps more, moving north through Bulgaria toward the Danube crossing that would bring them into Wallachia. Europe watched and waited and did not move. Vlad retreated before them, deliberately drawing the Ottoman column deeper into Wallachian territory, into a landscape that was becoming, mile by mile, increasingly hostile. He burned the fields behind him. He poisoned the wells. He drove the cattle north, away from the advancing army. He left nothing that 60,000 men could eat or drink. The forest closed around the Ottoman column, like water closing over a stone. And somewhere ahead of them, just beyond the range of their scouts, a prince who had spent his entire life learning to be patient was waiting for the right kind of dark. The night of June 17th, 1462, has no monument. No plaque marks the ground where it happened. No annual ceremony remembers it. It exists only in documents, Ottoman chronicles that describe it with the careful restraint of scribes writing about something their patrons found embarrassing, and Wallachian accounts that describe it with the breathless imprecision of people who are not entirely certain what they had witnessed. What both agree on is the outline. And the outline is extraordinary. Vlad led the attack himself. He took a force. Estimates range widely, but the consensus suggests somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men, and rode directly into the Ottoman camp in the middle of the night. Not around it, not toward its edges. Into it. The goal was not to defeat the Ottoman army. It was to kill Mehmed. One man, in a camp of 60,000, located and eliminated before dawn. It was the kind of plan that requires either genius or madness, and which looks from the outside identical either way. The Wallachians moved through the camp in darkness, in silence, cutting through tent lines and supply routes, navigating by memory and by the particular discipline of men who understood that noise was death. They reached the area where Mehmed's tent was believed to be. They found, instead, the tents of his grand viziers, similar in scale, similar in placement, close enough to the right location that the mistake was entirely reasonable. The fighting that followed was brief and violent, and ultimately inconclusive. Mehmed, sleeping elsewhere in the camp, was woken by the sound of it. He survived. The attack collapsed before it could reach him. Vlad retreated into the forest before the Ottoman response could fully organize. He had not killed the Sultan. He had come close enough that the Ottoman army spent the following days moving with a caution it had not shown before. Close enough that Mehmed, in his own correspondence, acknowledged the attack, not with the dismissiveness of a man describing a minor incident, but with the measured language of someone who understood what had nearly happened. The night raid entered the memory of the campaign as something that should not have been possible. A reminder that the man retreating ahead of them was not retreating out of fear. The Ottoman column pushed north, toward Târgoviște, toward the Wallachian capital, which Vlad had already abandoned, emptied of its population, stripped of anything useful, left as a shell that offered the advancing army nothing but the symbolic satisfaction of arrival. And then, on the road approaching the city, the Ottoman advance guard stopped. What they found has been described in the sources with a consistency that suggests it was simply too large to misremember. A forest of stakes stretching across the plain outside the city. The accounts disagree on the exact number. Some say 20,000, some say more. But they agree on the scale, on the deliberate arrangement, on the way it had been constructed, not merely as execution, but as spectacle. Ottoman prisoners, taken during Vlad's campaign south of the Danube and in the weeks since. Arranged by rank, the tallest stakes at the center. The smell reached the advance guard before the sight did. And the sight, when it came, stopped an Ottoman army that had taken Constantinople and broken empires, and marched through landscapes of devastation without slowing. It stopped them. Mehmed rode forward to see it himself. The sources record that he said very little. One account, from a Serbian janissary who was present, describes him sitting on his horse for a long time in silence, looking at what had been built for him to find. Then he turned and rode back toward the column. What he said, if anything, was not recorded. What he did, in the days that followed, was he turned the army around. Not immediately, and not without attempting other approaches, raids, negotiations, through intermediaries, support for Vlad's brother Radu, who had remained in Ottoman service and now represented an alternative claim to the Wallachian throne. But the great push north, the full weight of the Ottoman campaign, did not continue. Mehmed, who had taken Constantinople, who had never been turned back by a Christian force, withdrew from Wallachia without taking its capital. He left the field to a man with fewer soldiers, less money, and no allies who had shown up when asked. The forest outside Targovishte stood for some time after. The birds did not return to that part of the plain for longer than anyone measured. The enemy that finally broke Vlad was not Mehmed. It was not the Ottoman army, or the Saxon merchants, or the boyars who had survived his purges by making themselves useful. It was his brother. Radu, younger, smoother, the one who had adapted where Vlad had only observed, came north from Ottoman territory at the head of a force that grew as it moved, gathering Wallachian defectors the way a river gathers tributaries. He did not need to fight his way in. He was invited. The boyars who remained, those who had calculated their survival through 6 years of Vlad's reign and found the mathematics increasingly unfavorable, opened the doors. Not all of them. Enough of them. Radu offered what Vlad had never offered, and perhaps never understood the value of offering: predictability. A return to the older arrangement, the one where the prince was a manageable variable rather than an absolute force, where loyalty was rewarded rather than merely assumed, where survival did not require constant recalculation. Vlad retreated north, into the mountains, toward the Carpathian passes that led into Transylvania. He was not fleeing exactly. He was doing what he had always done, moving to a position from which the next move was possible. But the position he found, at the end of that retreat, was a Hungarian prison. Matthias Corvinus, the new king of Hungary, had his own reasons for finding Vlad inconvenient. The alliance that had never quite materialized, the crusade against the Ottomans that Vlad had fought alone while Hungary watched, had left a complicated diplomatic residue. Matthias had also received the Saxon pamphlets, those German accounts of Vlad's atrocities, circulating now across Europe with illustrations that left nothing to the imagination. They were useful. A man described that way could be imprisoned without much explanation required. And so, in late 1462, Vlad entered a captivity that would last 12 years. The sources are vague about the conditions. Some suggest house arrest, relative comfort, a confinement more political than punitive. Others suggest something harder. What all of them agree on is the duration. 12 years. A man who had never stopped moving, never stopped calculating, held in a space from which there was no exit except patience. If you have found this story worth sitting with, if the weight of it has settled somewhere you didn't expect, this is a moment to mark it. A like costs nothing and says everything. It tells the archive that this kind of history deserves to be heard. The pamphlets that circulated during those 12 years are worth pausing on. They were printed in the German states, some of the earliest examples of mass-produced political content in European history, made possible by Gutenberg's press and distributed with a speed that manuscript culture had never achieved. They had titles that left nothing ambiguous. They described, in vivid detail and with accompanying woodcuts, the methods Vlad had used during his reign. They were read across Germany, Austria, Italy. They reached audiences who had never heard of Wallachia and would never be able to locate it on a map. They created, in the minds of those audiences, an image, not of a prince, not of a ruler with a political context and a military logic, but of something closer to a phenomenon. A man defined entirely by what he did to other men's bodies. The context was not included. Context, it turned out, did not sell. Vlad, in his prison, could not respond to them. He had no press. He had no intermediaries willing to distribute an alternative account. He had only time, and whatever it is that a man like that does with time when the world outside is busy deciding what he means. The accounts that survive from this period say almost nothing about his interior state. They note in passing that he kept small animals, mice, birds, and that he killed them. Whether this is true or embellishment added later to complete a portrait that was already forming is impossible to determine. It does not matter, in a sense. The portrait was forming regardless. Outside the prison walls, Wallachia continued its familiar rhythm of contested succession. Radu ruled, and then did not rule, and then ruled again. The Ottomans maintained their influence through him with the comfortable ease of a power managing a compliant client state. The roads were, by most accounts, less safe than they had been. The Golden Cup, if it had ever existed, was gone. The forest remembered a different arrangement. It was prepared, as forests always are, to wait. 12 years is long enough to become someone else. Most men do. They soften at the edges, revise their certainties, find accommodations with the world that they would not have accepted before the walls closed in. Confinement has a way of making the past look negotiable, of convincing men that what they believed, what they did, what they were willing to do again, belongs to a version of themselves that no longer quite exists. It is a form of erosion, slow, patient, and usually effective. The accounts from Vlad's imprisonment suggest it was not effective. He converted to Catholicism during those years, a political necessity, a condition likely attached to any prospect of release, and a gesture that Matthias Corvinus could present to the Pope as evidence of rehabilitation. He married a Hungarian noblewoman, a relative of Matthias, and fathered children. He moved by degrees from prisoner to ward to something approaching a guest, confined still, but within a larger space, with more access to the world outside. These were the visible changes, the ones that could be documented, reported, used. What did not change was harder to see and easier to feel. Visitors who met him during this period described a man of controlled courtesy and careful conversation, pleasant even. A man who listened well and revealed little, who asked precise questions and remembered every answer, who seemed to those who spent time with him to be tracking something, not in the room, not in the conversation, but somewhere beyond both, in a calculation that had not yet reached its conclusion. Radu died in 1475. Not violently, illness. The mundane conclusion that finds even the most politically useful men eventually. His death reopened the Wallachian succession in the way that deaths always did, releasing a pressure that had been building beneath the surface of a dozen competing claims. The Ottomans moved to install their preferred candidate. Hungary watched the border shift and made its own calculations. And Matthias Corvinus, who had kept Vlad in comfortable suspension for over a decade, looked at the board and decided that the piece he had been holding in reserve was at last worth playing. Vlad was released. Equipped. Pointed north and east toward a throne that had changed hands multiple times since he had last sat on it. He was in his mid-40s by then, old, by the standards of a century that treated the human body as a temporary arrangement. He had spent more than a quarter of his life in confinement. He rode back toward Wallachia through the same Carpathian passes he had fled through 12 years earlier, through a forest that had grown denser in his absence, through a landscape that did not know he was returning and would not have cared if it did. The third reign began in the summer of 1476. It was immediately apparent to those around him that the years had not produced the softening that imprisonment usually produces. The reports from the first weeks describe a man moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone who has a specific amount of time and intends to use all of it. Old enemies were identified. Old alliances were assessed. The boyars who remained from his previous reign watched with the careful attention of men who had survived once by reading the situation correctly and were not certain they could do it twice. What none of them knew, what Vlad himself may not have known, was how little time remained. The third reign would last months, not years. The exact number is debated by historians who have access to sources that agree on almost nothing except the ending. Somewhere between 2 and 3 months after his return, in the winter of 1476 or the very beginning of 1477, Vlad III died. In battle, most likely. The details are genuinely, frustratingly unclear. He was fighting the Ottomans. That much is certain. A small engagement near Bucharest against a force that should not have been a significant threat to a prince with Hungarian backing and a consolidated position. Something went wrong. His own men, some accounts suggest, a betrayal in the moment of battle, a sword from a direction he had not anticipated. Other accounts describe a simple military reversal, an ambush, an outcome that required no treachery to explain. The sources, as they always do with Vlad, disagree precisely at the moment that matters most. The forest offered no clarification. It never did. The head arrived in Constantinople sometime in early 1477. Mehmed had it displayed publicly. Confirmation, for an empire that had spent 15 years managing the consequences of one difficult man on its northern border, that the problem was resolved. The Ottoman sources record it briefly, almost administratively. A head. Identified. Displayed. The language is the language of bureaucracy closing a file. The body was never conclusively located. A monastery near the battlefield, Snagov, on an island in a lake south of Bucharest, has long been associated with his burial. Monks there claimed for centuries that he was interred beneath the floor near the altar. Excavations in the 20th century found the grave empty, or found bones that did not match, or found nothing at all, depending on which account of the excavation you read. The monastery still stands. The lake still surrounds it. The question of where Vlad III actually lies remains genuinely unanswered. This is the point at which most histories of Vlad end, or nearly end. The man is dead, the body is missing, the head is in Constantinople. The story has a conclusion, even if the conclusion is untidy. But there is another history running parallel to this one, quieter, slower, and in some ways more consequential than anything Vlad himself ever did. It is the history of what he became after he stopped being alive to control it. And that history begins not in Wallachia or Constantinople, but in the German print shops where his name had already been circulating for over a decade. The pamphlets had done their work. By the time of his death, Vlad III was already a figure of European-wide notoriety, not as a prince, not as a military commander who had held an Ottoman army at the edge of his country and made Mehmed II turn around, but as a monster. A man defined by a single method, stripped of context, reduced to the image that the woodcuts had fixed in the popular imagination. The name that attached to him, Dracula, son of Dracula, son of the dragon, had already begun its slow migration from patronymic to something else. Something that carried its own meaning, independent of the man who had owned it. If you're watching this in the dark, wherever you are, whatever hour it is, leave your location in the comments. The archive collects these things. Moments when people choose to sit with difficult history rather than look away from it. The process by which a historical figure becomes a myth follows no single path. Sometimes it requires centuries. Sometimes a generation is enough. What it always requires is a gap, a space between what the person actually was and what the audience needs them to be. Vlad provided an unusually wide gap. The reality was complicated. A ruler of genuine military intelligence, operating in impossible circumstances, using methods that were brutal by any standard, but not entirely without logic, in the context of 15th century Balkan politics. The myth required something simpler, something that did not ask the audience to hold complexity, something that could be illustrated in a woodcut and understood in a moment. The vampire emerged much later. Bram Stoker's novel appeared in 1897, 4 centuries after Vlad's death, and drew on his name and his Transylvanian geography while constructing a figure that had essentially nothing to do with the historical prince. Stoker had read about Vlad in research notes compiled by an Orientalist scholar, noted the name, noted the region, and built his architecture of horror on foundations that the original occupant would not have recognized. The count who sleeps in coffins and cannot cross running water and recoils from crucifixes is not Vlad Dracula. He is something the 19th century needed, a figure of ancient, aristocratic, seductive evil, at a moment when European culture was anxious about exactly those things. Vlad simply provided the address. And yet something persists across the distance between the man and the myth. Not the supernatural elements. Those belong entirely to Stoker and the tradition he synthesized. But something underneath them. The quality of a figure who cannot be fully contained. Who exceeds the frame built to hold him. Who means something that shifts depending on who is looking and what they need him to mean. In Romania, he is periodically reclaimed as a national hero, a prince who defended his country against an overwhelming force and made the most powerful empire in the world hesitate. In the West, he remains the monster of the pamphlets, updated and elaborated, but essentially unchanged. Both readings use the same man. Both are selective. Neither is entirely wrong. The forest outside Targovishte has grown back completely. The plain where the stake stood is farmland now. There is nothing there that would tell you what happened, nothing that would slow your step or catch your eye. The land keeps its record in a language that requires patience to read. And patience, in the end, was always the thing that Vlad understood better than anyone who tried to contain him. What remains in the end is a question that the documents cannot answer. Not about the method, not about the numbers, not about whether the Golden Cup existed or whether the grave at Snagov was ever occupied. Those are questions of fact, and facts, given enough time and enough competing sources, tend eventually towards some kind of settlement. The question that remains is simpler and harder than any of those. It is the question of what a man like Vlad understood about the world he lived in, and whether that understanding, however terrible its expression, was wrong. Wallachia survived. That is not nothing. Surrounded by forces that had consumed larger and better resourced principalities without pausing, pressed between two empires that treated its existence as a variable rather than a fact, it survived. Not comfortably, not cleanly, and not for long after Vlad's death in the form he had tried to give it. But it survived long enough to become, centuries later, part of the state that is now Romania. The thread did not break. Whether Vlad's methods were necessary to prevent that break, or whether they were the expression of something darker and more personal than political necessity, is a question that historians have been arguing about for 500 years without resolution. They will likely continue. What the forest remembers is not the argument. It remembers the weight of specific things. The sound of an army moving through the Carpathian passes in winter. The smell of burned fields and poisoned wells along the road south. The particular silence that settles over a plain after something has been built on it that no one can look at directly. These are not things that resolve into conclusions. They are things that simply remain, stored in soil and stone, and the slow memory of places that have outlasted every human argument about what they mean. The birds came back eventually. They always do. The crows returned to the road from Targovishte. The forest filled again with the ordinary sounds of ordinary life, continuing in the way that life continues, without acknowledgement, without ceremony, without any particular regard for what has happened in the space it now occupies. A peasant ploughing a field does not feel the history beneath the blade. Or perhaps he does, in some way that does not have a name, and simply continues ploughing. Vlad III ruled Wallachia for a total of perhaps 7 years across 3 reigns. He was prince of a small territory that most of Europe could not locate, and most of his contemporaries considered a backwater. He died in unclear circumstances, was buried in an unknown location, and had his name attached to a fictional vampire 4 centuries after his death by a novelist who had never visited the country he described. By any conventional measure of historical significance, he should be a footnote. A minor figure in the long history of a turbulent region. A name that specialists know and everyone else does not. Instead, he is everywhere. In films, in novels, in Halloween costumes and tourist brochures and academic conferences and endless online arguments about whether he was a monster or a hero, or something that does not fit cleanly into either category. He occupies a space in the collective imagination that princes 10 times more powerful and 10 times more historically consequential never managed to reach. The question of why is worth sitting with. Part of it is the method. Impalement is visceral and visual in a way that most historical violence is not, and the image, once fixed in the mind, does not easily leave. Part of it is the name, and what Stoker did with it. But underneath both of those, there is something else. Something in the figure of a man who looked at a world that offered him no good options, and chose the most extreme version of agency available to him. Who decided, at some point that no document records, that he would rather be feared than managed. That he would rather be remembered as a monster than forgotten as a compromise. Whether he made that decision consciously, whether it was a decision at all, or simply the inevitable expression of what those years in the Ottoman court and the years in Hungarian captivity had made of him, is something no archive can tell us. The Carpathians are still there. The passes are paved now, the forests managed, the villages connected by roads that would have been unrecognizable to any 15th century traveler. But the mountains themselves have not changed in any way that matters. They still hold the cold the same way. The clouds still move through the high passes with the same indifference to the arguments happening below them. And in the particular quality of a winter evening in that part of the world, the early dark, the smell of wood smoke, the sound of wind through trees that have stood longer than any human memory, there is something that does not quite resolve. Something that remains open. If there is a story you think this archive should tell next, a silence that deserves to be broken, a figure history has misread or forgotten, leave it in the comments. This is how the archive grows. One quiet room at a time. The forest watched him come, and it watched him go, and it has watched everything that came after. It is watching still. That is what forests do. They outlast the things that happen inside them, and they keep their records in a language that only patience can read. And somewhere in that language, in the weight of old wood and frozen ground, and the long memory of places that have seen too much to be surprised by any of it, the question remains. Not answered. Not closed. Simply there. The way certain things are simply there, waiting for someone willing to sit with them long enough to feel the full weight of what they mean. The myth did not arrive fully formed. It was assembled, piece by piece, by people who had never met Vlad, and had no particular interest in accuracy. What they had was a press, an audience, and a figure whose name had already begun to carry a weight that ordinary names do not carry. The German pamphlets of the 1460s and 1470s were not journalism in any modern sense. They were something older and more deliberate, the calculated distribution of a specific image, designed to produce a specific response in a specific audience. Fear, primarily. And beneath the fear, something harder to name. The particular fascination that extreme human behavior has always produced in people who are safe enough to observe it from a distance. The woodcuts that accompanied the pamphlets deserve attention. They were crude by the standards of the era's finest printmakers, but crudeness, in this context, was almost an advantage. The images were clear, unmistakable. A figure seated at a table, surrounded by steaks, eating a meal with the composed attention of a man who finds his surroundings entirely unremarkable. The detail of the meal, the eating, the normality of appetite in an abnormal landscape, was what lodged in the imagination. Not the steaks themselves, which medieval audiences had seen before in various forms, but the combination. The refusal of the central figure to be disturbed by what surrounded him. This image traveled, reproduced, copied, carried across trade routes from the German states into the Low Countries, into Italy, into the courts of rulers who had their own reasons for being interested in cautionary tales about what unchecked power looked like. It arrived in places that could not locate Wallachia on any available map. It arrived in languages that had no word for the specific political context that had produced the man in the image. It arrived, stripped of everything except the image itself, and the image was enough. More than enough. What the image could not carry was the winter of 1462. The burned fields and the poisoned wells. The Ottoman column, moving north, through a landscape that was consuming itself ahead of them, denying them everything they needed to sustain a force of 60,000 men in hostile territory. The night raid into Mehmed's camp, the darkness, the silence, the discipline of men moving through an enemy army without being heard. The calculation behind all of it. The years of observation and patience that had made the calculation possible. None of that fit in a woodcut. None of that made the pamphlets. History is, in this sense, always a competition between what can be illustrated and what cannot. The image wins almost every time. Not because it is more true, but because it is more immediate, because it arrives in the mind without requiring the effort that context demands. Vlad understood this, in his own way, before the pamphlets existed. The forest of stakes outside Targovishte was itself an image, constructed with the deliberate awareness that Mehmed would see it, that his commanders would see it, that the account of it would travel back through the Ottoman chain of command and arrive at every level with the same effect. He had used the power of the image before the printing press used it against him. The irony is almost too precise to be accidental. The pamphlets named him Dracula consistently. Not Vlad, not the Prince of Wallachia, not any of the titles that attached to his actual position. Dracula, the name his father had carried as a member of the Order of the Dragon, inherited by the son as patronymic, now detached from both of those origins and floating free in the European imagination as something that needed no explanation. A name that sounded, to German and Italian ears, exactly like what it was becoming. Something ancient. Something not quite human. Something that had always been there, in the dark at the edge of the known world, waiting to be given a name that fit. The man who owned that name was, at the time the pamphlets peaked in circulation, sitting in a Hungarian prison, working through whatever calculations a man like that works through when the world outside has decided what he is, and he has no means of disagreeing. Whether he knew the extent of his own notoriety is unclear. Whether it would have changed anything if he had known is a more interesting question, and the answer is probably no. He had never been particularly interested in how he was perceived by people who were not in the room with him. Perception, for Vlad, was a tool, something you managed in the service of an outcome, not something you tended for its own sake. The pamphlets were managing his perception in directions he had not chosen and could not correct. This was perhaps the one form of powerlessness he had not prepared for. Outside the prison walls, the name continued its slow transformation. Each retelling added something and removed something else. The political context thinned with each passing year, each new audience, each translation into a language that had its own assumptions about what men from the eastern edge of Europe were capable of. What remained, distilled through decades of retelling, was an essence, a figure of absolute will, indifferent to consequence, located at the boundary between the human and something older and darker than the human. It was not Vlad. It was built from Vlad, the way a fire is built from wood, consuming the original material in the process of becoming something that burns longer and travels further than wood ever could. The forest remembered the wood. The rest of the world remembered the fire. There is a monastery on an island in a lake south of Bucharest that has been answering the same question for 500 years. The question is always some version of the same thing. Is he here? Is this where they brought him? The monks who have maintained Snagov Monastery across the centuries have given different answers at different times, depending on who was asking and what answer served the moment. For a long time, the answer was yes. He was buried near the altar, beneath the stone floor, in the place of honor reserved for princes who had been patrons of the church. Vlad had been a patron of Snagov, had funded repairs, had maintained a connection to the monastery that the records confirm, even if they do not explain. It was a reasonable place to bring a body, if there had been a body to bring. The excavation of 1931 found the grave empty, or nearly empty. Accounts differ on exactly what was discovered beneath the stone, and the archaeological records from that period are themselves incomplete, which is either a mundane archival failure or, depending on your disposition, something more suggestive. A subsequent excavation found bones in a different location within the monastery, bones that were examined, attributed tentatively to a high-status individual of the appropriate period, and then lost. Actually lost. Misplaced between one institution and another, in the bureaucratic confusion of mid-20th century Romania, and never conclusively recovered. The man who may have nailed turbans to ambassadors' heads, who may have built a forest of stakes visible from a distance of miles, who made Mehmed II turn an army around. His remains, if they exist anywhere, are in a box in a storage facility that no one has been able to identify with certainty. Or they are still beneath the floor at Snagov, or they are somewhere else entirely. The question remains open in a way that feels, given everything, entirely appropriate. Romania's relationship with Vlad has never been simple. In the centuries following his death, he occupied an ambiguous position in the national memory, acknowledged, occasionally celebrated, but not quite claimed in the way that founding figures tend to be claimed. The Ottoman context made him complicated. A prince who had fought the empire that would eventually control Romanian territory for centuries was useful as a symbol of resistance. A prince who had impaled tens of thousands of his own subjects was less useful as a symbol of anything a modern state wanted to associate with itself. The two facts existed in permanent tension, handled differently by different periods, depending on what the political moment required. During the communist period, under Nicolae Ceausescu, Vlad was rehabilitated with particular enthusiasm. Ceausescu's government promoted a version of Romanian national history that emphasized continuity, resistance to foreign domination, and the heroism of strong central leadership, all qualities that could be mapped, with sufficient interpretive flexibility, onto Vlad's reign. The impalement was reframed as necessary severity in the defense of the nation. The terror was reframed as order. The man who had ruled by fear was reframed as the man who had made Wallachia ungovernable by its enemies. It was, in its way, exactly what the German pamphlet writers had done in reverse, the same selective use of the same facts to produce a completely different image. History as a tool. Vlad would have recognized the method. The tourism came later, and with it a different kind of appropriation. Bran Castle, a fortification in Transylvania that has a disputed and probably minimal connection to the historical Vlad, became Dracula's castle in the popular imagination and on the tourist maps, drawing visitors from every continent to a building that the man himself may never have entered. The gift shops sell capes and plastic fangs and bottles of wine with a bat on the label. The coaches arrive in the morning and leave in the afternoon, and the visitors photograph themselves in front of a castle that belongs, in any historically meaningful sense, to a fictional count rather than an actual prince. The actual sites associated with Vlad, Poenari, the ruined fortress his captive boyars built with their bodies, clinging to a cliff face in the mountains above the Argeș River, receive a fraction of the visitors. They are harder to reach. The road is narrow. There are no gift shops. The castle is a ruin. It is, for all of those reasons, much closer to the truth. Puinari still stands in the way that ruins stand, not triumphantly, not as a monument, but as the simple persistence of stone that has not yet found a reason to fall. The walls are incomplete. The towers are open to the sky. To reach it, you climb nearly 1,500 steps cut into the mountain, through forest that closes overhead and produces, even in summer, a particular quality of shadow that feels older than the path through it. At the top, the view is extraordinary. The Argesh Valley below, the Carpathians in every direction, the sense of a landscape that has not fundamentally changed in 500 years. The wind comes through the ruined walls with a consistency that suggests it has always come through them, that it was coming through them when the men who built them were still alive, that it will continue long after the last stone has finally given way. There is nothing at Puinari that explains Vlad. No placard adequate to the task, no reconstruction that captures what it meant to build this place under the conditions it was built. There is only the stone and the wind and the view and the particular silence of a place that has absorbed too much to announce any of it. The forest below holds the mountain the way it has always held it, without judgment, without explanation, with only the patience of something that has been there longer than the question and expects to be there long after the question is forgotten. The question that Puinari cannot answer is the one that has always mattered most. Not what Vlad did. The documents are sufficient on that point, however much they disagree on scale and detail. Not even why he did it, in the narrow sense of political logic and military calculation. The question is what he believed. What a man who had seen what he had seen, who had lived inside two of the most powerful political systems of his era as a captive and as a ruler, actually thought about the world he moved through. Whether there was, beneath the method and the calculation, something that could be called a conviction. The letters survive. Not many, a handful, scattered across archives in Brasov and Sibiu and Budapest, but enough to hear a voice that the pamphlets never captured. They are written in Latin and in the chancellery Romanian of the period, and they cover the practical business of a ruler managing a principality under permanent pressure, requests for military support, reports on Ottoman movements, trade disputes, border incidents. They are not introspective documents. They were not written to reveal anything about the man behind them. But in the aggregate, in the precision of the language and the consistency of the concerns, something emerges. He was afraid of disorder. Not in the way that timid men are afraid of disorder, not as an anxiety, not as a preference for quiet. In the way that men who have seen what disorder produces are afraid of it. He had grown up in a principality where princes were killed by their own boyars, where loyalty was a transaction that expired the moment a better offer arrived, where the throne was not a seat of power, but a target. He had spent years in a foreign court, watching how a genuinely powerful state maintained itself, through hierarchy, through consequence, through the absolute clarity of what happened to those who stepped outside the established order. He had returned to Wallachia and found a place that had none of that clarity. And he had decided, at some point, that no document records to provide it. Whether the scale of what followed was necessary, or whether it exceeded necessity by a margin that reflected something personal and ungovernable in the man himself, is the question that every serious historian of the period eventually reaches, and none of them fully resolves. The honest answer is that both things are probably true simultaneously. That the political logic was real, and the personal darkness was also real, and that they reinforced each other in ways that made the separation of one from the other impossible, even for Vlad himself, if he ever attempted it. which the documents suggest he did not. He does not appear, in any surviving record, to have expressed doubt about his methods. He does not appear to have experienced, or at least to have recorded, the kind of retrospective horror that later ages would consider the appropriate response to what he had done. Either he was certain, or he was very good at performing certainty, or the distinction between those two things had collapsed so completely that it no longer mattered. The Ottoman sources are interesting on this point. They describe him with a consistency that the Western pamphlets lack, not as a monster exactly, but as a particular kind of opponent. Dangerous not because of the violence itself, which the Ottoman Empire had encountered in many forms, but because of the quality of attention behind it. The night raid on Mehmet's camp is described in terms that suggest professional respect, the planning, the discipline, the willingness to attempt something that should not have been possible. An empire that had conquered Constantinople could afford to be precise about the difference between an enemy who was merely brutal and an enemy who was brutal and intelligent. Vlad, in the Ottoman sources, is clearly the second kind. Mehmed himself wrote about him. Not extensively, a few references in correspondence and chronicle, but with a directness that the diplomatic language of the period usually obscures. He acknowledged the forest of stakes. He acknowledged, in terms that required no interpretation, that what he found outside Targovishte had affected him. A man who had watched Constantinople fall, who had stood at the edge of the world's largest empire and decided it was not large enough, was affected by what one prince of a small Wallachian principality had built in the weeks before his arrival. That fact alone says something about Vlad that the pamphlets never managed to say, because the pamphlets were made by people who were afraid of him. Mehmed was not afraid of him. He was something more precise than afraid. He was impressed. The Carpathians hold that particular piece of the story without comment. Two men, on opposite sides of the most significant religious and political boundary of the 15th century, recognizing something in each other that their respective worlds had not prepared them to encounter. A sultan who had remade the world, looking at the work of a prince who had refused to let his small corner of it be absorbed. The stakes rotting slowly in the summer heat outside an abandoned capital. The army turning south. The forest closing behind it. What Vlad thought, watching that army leave, is not recorded. He had won something, not the war, not the peace, not the security he had spent his entire reign trying to construct, but something. A moment in which the world had confirmed what he had always believed about the relationship between will and outcome. That outcomes could be forced. That the gap between what was possible and what was impossible was narrower than most men assumed. That the price of crossing that gap was simply higher than most men were willing to pay. He had always been willing to pay it. That, in the end, is what the forest remembers most clearly. The boyars who survived him did not write memoirs. This is not surprising. The class of men who had navigated Wallachian politics across the 15th century had developed, over generations, a very precise instinct for what should and should not be committed to writing. Loyalty to a dead prince was the kind of sentiment that could become expensive if the next prince turned out to be someone who preferred a different version of recent history. The Wallachian nobility had survived by being flexible on exactly this point. They had survived Vlad by the same method, those who had survived at all. What they left instead was silence. A conspicuous, almost architectural silence in the domestic record of the period, the absence of the kind of local chronicle, personal correspondence, and administrative documentation that other European courts of the era produced in quantity. Wallachia under Vlad generated records, but most of them were generated by people outside it, looking in. The Saxons wrote about him because he was destroying their trade. The Hungarians wrote about him because he was a diplomatic problem. The Ottomans wrote about him because he was a military one. The Wallachians themselves, the people who lived inside his reign and experienced it from the inside, left almost nothing, either because they were afraid to, or because the infrastructure of literacy and record-keeping that would have preserved their accounts was itself disrupted by the conditions of the reign. Or both. The peasant accounts that do survive, fragments mostly, embedded in later chronicles written by monks who were themselves working from oral tradition, describe something different from the picture the pamphlets painted. Not uniformly different. The violence is present in these accounts too, unreduced and unromanticized. But alongside it, consistently, is something else. A description of roads that were safe to travel, of disputes that were settled, however brutally, rather than left to fester, of a principality that functioned, in the practical sense that mattered most to people whose lives were organized around the harvest and the market and the road between the two. The golden cup at the fountain appears in these accounts too, probably mythologized, possibly invented, but repeated often enough that it was clearly capturing something people felt to be true about the period, even if the specific detail was embellished. Something had been different. Something had worked, in the narrow and terrible sense that order works when it is maintained by methods that cannot be separated from the order itself. This is the part of Vlad's story that the myth cannot accommodate. The vampire of Stoker's novel does not build roads or settle disputes or make it safe to carry goods between villages. He is purely consumptive, a figure who takes, who drains, who leaves nothing behind but absence. The historical Vlad was something more ambiguous and therefore more disturbing. He was productive in the specific sense that certain kinds of terror are productive, that the fear of consequence, applied consistently enough, generates a form of social order that functions even as it destroys the conditions necessary for anything better to grow. It is an order built on a foundation that cannot last. But while it lasts, it works. And the people who lived inside it, who needed the roads to be safe and the disputes to be settled and the thieves to have made different calculations about their profession, experienced it as something real, as something that had value, even if the price of that value was one they had not chosen to pay. The church complicated this further. Vlad was, by the standards of his era, a religious man, not in the private, contemplative sense, but in the public, institutional sense of a ruler who understood the church as a pillar of legitimate authority and maintained it accordingly. He funded monasteries, including Snagov. He framed his campaigns against the Ottomans in explicitly religious terms: the defense of Christendom, the crusade that the Western powers had promised and never delivered. His letters to the Pope and to the Christian kings of Europe invoke this framing consistently, with the fluency of a man who had been educated in its vocabulary and understood its rhetorical power. Whether he believed it, in any personal sense, is impossible to determine. The framing served his political purposes regardless of its sincerity. But the monasteries were real, and the funding was real, and the monks who prayed for his soul at Snagov were praying for the soul of a man who had, by any conventional moral accounting, a great deal to answer for. They prayed anyway. This too is part of the record. The Orthodox Church of Wallachia did not excommunicate him, did not publicly condemn his methods, did not position itself as a moral counterweight to the terror of his reign. It accepted his patronage and offered its prayers and maintained the relationship that churches and princes had always maintained in that part of the world, a mutual recognition of each other's necessity, a shared understanding that the alternative to cooperation was a kind of exposure that neither party could afford. The church survived Vlad. It survived Radu. It survived the Ottoman period that followed. It was very good at surviving. It had learned, over centuries, the same lesson that the boyars had learned, and that Vlad himself had learned in a different school, that survival required a particular relationship with power, and that relationship required a flexibility that could not always be distinguished, from the outside, from complicity. The forest made no such accommodations. It had no theology, no political calculation, no need to position itself relative to whoever held the throne. It simply grew and remembered, and waited for the questions to stop mattering in the way that questions eventually stop mattering when enough time has passed. The Carpathians were old before Vlad was born. They will be old long after the last pamphlet has crumbled, and the last tourist has photographed the last castle, and the last historian has closed the last archive, and conceded that some things simply cannot be resolved. The mountains do not require resolution. They require only time. And time, in the Carpathians, has never been in short supply. Bram Stoker never visited Transylvania. This fact, which surprises people more than it should, is confirmed by every biographical account of the novelist and by the complete absence of any travel record placing him east of Vienna. He built his Transylvania from books, from the accounts of travelers and ethnographers and folklorists who had been there, and returned with notes, impressions, and the particular kind of selective attention that the 19th century brought to places it considered exotic. He built it well enough that generations of readers accepted it as geography rather than construction. Well enough that the construction eventually became more real, in the popular imagination, than the place itself. Tourists arrive in Romania looking for a country that exists primarily in a novel written by a man who never crossed its border. Stoker encountered Vlad in the notes of Arminius Vambury, a Hungarian-British Orientalist and traveller who had actually been to the region and who mentioned in conversation with Stoker the historical prince whose name had attached itself to the Wallachian ruling house. The name was enough. Dracula. It had a sound that the English language found immediately suggestive. The hard consonants, the dark vowels, the way it sat in the mouth like something that should not be said aloud in daylight. Stoker had been developing his vampire novel for years, assembling its architecture from multiple folkloric traditions, searching for a center that would hold the whole construction together. The name gave him that center. The historical Vlad gave him almost nothing else. Count Dracula, as Stoker constructed him, shares with the historical Vlad primarily a name and a geography, and even the geography is approximate, since the Count's castle is placed in Transylvania rather than Wallachia, in a region that Vlad visited but never ruled. The Count is aristocratic in the specifically Victorian sense, ancient lineage, crumbling estate, the authority of old blood asserting itself against the rational modernity of the novel's English protagonists. He is seductive where Vlad was repellent. He is subtle where Vlad was direct. He operates through concealment and manipulation where Vlad operated through visibility and shock. They are as figures, almost opposites. What they share is the quality of excess, of a will that exceeds the boundaries that ordinary social life attempts to place around it. That quality was enough to make the name feel right. Everything else Stoker invented. The novel appeared in 1897 and was not initially a sensation. It sold modestly, received mixed reviews, and was considered by some critics to be overly long and insufficiently disciplined for the genre it occupied. Stoker died in 1912 without knowing that he had written one of the most culturally durable works in the English language. The transformation of Dracula from moderately successful Gothic novel to global cultural phenomenon happened after his death, driven by the stage adaptations of the 1920s and the Universal Pictures film of 1931 that fixed Bela Lugosi's interpretation in the collective imagination with an authority that no subsequent version has entirely displaced. The cape, the accent, the particular way of moving through a room as though the room belongs to you, these are Lugosi's contributions, not Stoker's, and certainly not Vlad's. But they attached to the name, and the name was Vlad's. And so the chain of association, however attenuated, however distorted by 4 centuries of retelling and reinvention, held. What the myth required, at each stage of its development, tells us more about the audience than about the subject. The German pamphlet readers of the 1470s needed a figure who embodied the terror of the East, the Ottoman threat, given a human face that was close enough to be recognizable and strange enough to be frightening. The Victorian readers of Stoker's novel needed something different, a figure of ancient, aristocratic seduction, at a moment when the century's confidence in progress and rationality was beginning to develop its first serious cracks. The 20th century needed something else again, the monster as spectacle, as entertainment, as a safe container for fears that the actual century was generating in quantities that required some form of displacement. Vlad accommodated all of these needs without having chosen any of them. He was, in this sense, the ideal mythological subject, specific enough to feel real, distant enough to be reshaped, and attached to a name that had, from the beginning, sounded like exactly what people needed it to mean. In Romania, the relationship with the myth has always been complicated by the presence of the history underneath it. Romanians know who Vlad actually was, or know the outline, the Ottoman context, the military campaigns, the reign that was brutal and brief, and followed by 5 centuries of argument about what it meant. They have watched the rest of the world take that history and replace it with a vampire, and the response has ranged from amusement to irritation to a pragmatic acceptance that the tourist economy attached to the fictional count is real money regardless of its historical basis. The castle at Bran charges an entrance fee. Poenari does not charge very much at all. The market has expressed its preference clearly, and the market, as always, is indifferent to accuracy. The Argeș River still runs below Poenari. In winter, when the water is low, you can see the riverbed clearly, the stones worn smooth by a current that has been running in the same direction since before the castle above it existed. The water does not know about the myth. It does not know about the pamphlets, or the novel, or the film, or the gift shops at Bran. It knows only the gradient of the land and the direction it has always moved, and the patient work of wearing stone into something that offers no resistance. It has been doing this for longer than any human argument about what happened on the cliff above it. It will be doing it long after the argument is finished. The forest above the river holds the castle the way it holds everything, without preference, without judgment, with only the patience of something that has never needed the story to end. The 15th century did not think of itself as the 15th century. It thought of itself as now, as the present moment of a world that had always existed and would continue to exist in roughly the form it currently occupied. The people who lived through Vlad's reign did not know they were living through something that would be studied, argued over, and mythologized for the next 500 years. They knew only the specific texture of their specific days, the cold of the Carpathian winters, the weight of Ottoman taxation, the particular anxiety of living in a principality whose prince had a habit of resolving uncertainty in ways that produced new and more immediate uncertainties. History, for the people inside it, is never the clean narrative that it becomes for the people who come after. It is weather. It is the road conditions on a particular morning. It is the calculation, made before leaving the house, of whether today is a day when the road is safe to travel. The merchants of Brasov made this calculation constantly during Vlad's reign. Their letters, preserved in the city archives, dry and precise, and occasionally erupting into a language that suggests the writer has moved past professional complaint into something closer to genuine fear, document a relationship with the Wallachian principality that shifted, over the course of a few years, from profitable inconvenience to active threat. They describe convoys that did not arrive, agents who went south and did not return, warehouses burned in reprisal for trading practices that Vlad had decided, unilaterally and without negotiation, were no longer acceptable. They describe, in one account that has been cited by every historian of the period, a field outside the Wallachian border where the stakes had been arranged in a pattern that the writer struggled to describe and did not attempt to count. And yet the trade continued. This is the detail that the pamphlets never included, because it complicated the image they were constructing. Even at the height of the violence, even when the letters from Brasov were describing scenes that sound like the end of commercial civilization, the goods kept moving, in smaller quantities, on different routes, under different arrangements, but moving. Because the alternative to trading with a dangerous principality was not trading with a safe one. There was no safe one. There was only the calculation of which risks were manageable and which were not, and the slow, pragmatic adjustment of behavior to accommodate a new set of rules that no one had agreed to, and everyone was following anyway. This is how power actually works, most of the time. Not through the dramatic confrontations that make it into the historical record, but through the accumulation of small adjustments made by ordinary people who have decided that the cost of resistance exceeds the cost of compliance. Vlad understood this at a level that most rulers of his era did not, or did not apply with the same consistency. He understood that terror does not need to be universal to be effective. It needs only to be credible. A punishment applied to 10 people changes the calculations of 10,000, provided the 10,000 believe, with sufficient certainty, that the same punishment is available to them if they make the wrong choice. The golden cup at the fountain was not guarded. It did not need to be. The guard was in the minds of everyone who walked past it. The Ottomans had taught him this, though they would not have described it in these terms. The court at Edirne operated on exactly this principle, the constant, ambient awareness of consequence that made explicit enforcement largely unnecessary. You did not need to witness a punishment to understand that punishment existed. You needed only to understand the system well enough to know where its boundaries were. Vlad had spent years learning that system from the inside, in the specific way that captives learn the systems of their captors, not as abstract principles, but as the lived texture of daily navigation. He had returned to Wallachia with that knowledge intact, and had applied it to a principality that had never been governed by anything resembling consistent consequence. The results were predictable, to him if not to anyone else. What he could not have predicted, what perhaps no one in the 15th century could have predicted, was the printing press. Not its existence, which was known, but its appetite. The speed with which it found subjects that an audience would pay to read about, and the ruthlessness with which it stripped those subjects of anything that complicated the central image. Vlad had controlled his own image with great care throughout his reign. The composed expression, the deliberate symbolism, the calculated visibility of punishment, designed to communicate specific messages to specific audiences. The press took that image and reproduced it beyond any border he could manage, in forms he had not approved, for audiences he had never considered. He had understood, better than almost anyone of his era, how fear travels. He had not understood how quickly a press could carry it somewhere he could not follow. The Saxons who wrote the pamphlets were afraid of him. This is worth remembering. The image they constructed was not invented from nothing. It was built from real experiences, real losses, real encounters with a prince who had demonstrated, repeatedly and without ambiguity, that he meant exactly what his actions said he meant. The fear was legitimate. What the pamphlets did was take that legitimate fear and remove it from its context, extract it from the specific political and military circumstances that had produced it, and present it as a portrait of a nature rather than a response to a situation. This is what propaganda has always done. It takes the real and makes it absolute. It takes the conditional and makes it essential. It takes a man who made choices and turns him into a thing that simply is. The forest outside Targovishte made no such transformation. It had seen the choices made one by one in real time, in the specific weather of specific days. It held them all, the calculation and the excess, the political logic and whatever lay beneath it, the man who had been a hostage and the prince who had come back from that. It held them without reduction. Without the editorial decision that every human account eventually makes, the choice of which parts to keep and which to let go in the service of a story that can be told in the time available. The forest had all the time available. It could afford to hold everything. There is a particular kind of man who does not become less dangerous with age. Most men do. The years accumulate their weight, the body negotiates its compromises, and the certainties that drove the younger version of the person soften into something more accommodating. Not wisdom necessarily, but a practical recognition that the world resists being forced, and that resistance has costs. The dangerous men are the ones in whom none of this happens, in whom the years produce not softening but concentration, a distillation of whatever was already there into a form that is purer, and therefore more extreme than the original. These men are rare. History notices them disproportionately, because what they do tends to leave marks that outlast them. Vlad rode back into Wallachia in 1476 as this kind of man. The 12 years had not softened him. They had concentrated him. The conversion to Catholicism was political performance, executed with the fluency of a man who had learnt, in the Ottoman court, that religious identity was a language rather than a conviction, something you spoke or declined to speak, depending on the audience and the requirement of the moment. The Hungarian wife was a diplomatic arrangement that served the purposes of both parties. The children were real, presumably, in the way that children are always real, but they do not appear in the surviving record with the kind of presence that suggests Vlad's attention was significantly occupied by them. His attention, as it had always been, was elsewhere. On the throne he had lost. On the principality that had been governed, in his absence, by a series of men whose inadequacy he would have been tracking from a distance with the patience of someone who knew the moment would come. The moment had come. Radu was dead. The Ottoman candidate who had replaced him was weak, contested, maintained in position by external support rather than internal legitimacy. The boyars, who had survived by accommodating whoever held the throne, were in their familiar posture of waiting, watching the approaches from Transylvania, calculating which of the available options offered the best return on the investment of their loyalty. When Vlad appeared, backed by Hungarian forces and the implicit endorsement of Matthias Corvinus, enough of them made the calculation in his favor to tip the balance. Not out of affection, not out of conviction. Out of the same arithmetic that had always governed Wallachian politics, the assessment of which way the weight was falling and the rapid adjustment of position to avoid being underneath it. The third reign began in the summer of 1476, with a speed that suggests Vlad had been planning its details for considerably longer than the months since his release. Old enemies were identified with a precision that implied lists maintained over years. Old alliances were reactivated or renegotiated with the efficiency of a man working from a map he had been studying in his head since the last time he had access to the territory it described. The accounts from this period describe a prince moving at a pace that the court around him struggled to match, issuing decisions, organizing the military, addressing the Ottoman threat that had not diminished in his absence and had, if anything, grown more immediate. He did not appear to be a man reclaiming something lost. He appeared to be a man resuming something interrupted. The Ottomans responded. They could not afford not to. A Vlad on the Wallachian throne, backed by Hungary and apparently undimmed by 12 years of captivity, was not a variable they could manage through the usual channels of diplomatic pressure and client-state manipulation that had served them well with his predecessors. They had tried that approach once before, and the result was standing in a field outside Targoviste in 20,000 iterations. They sent forces south of the Danube, probing the border, testing the response of the new administration, with the careful attention of a power that had learned, expensively, not to underestimate this particular opponent. What happened next enters the record through its absence rather than its presence. The sources go quiet at a specific point, not the dramatic silence of a suppressed account, but the quieter silence of events that moved faster than the infrastructure of documentation could follow. There was a military engagement near Bucharest in the winter of 1476 or early 1477. The details are genuinely unclear in a way that is not entirely explained by the limitations of 15th century record keeping. Something happened that the people who were there had reasons not to describe carefully. The outcome was unambiguous. The documentation of how it was reached is not. The boyars, who had just recalculated their loyalty in his direction, recalculated again, with the speed that suggested the calculation had never been fully settled. Some accounts point to men in his own force, Wallachians, not Hungarians, whose positions in the engagement placed them close enough to affect its outcome in ways that an enemy force attacking from outside could not have managed. Other accounts describe a straightforward military reversal, a flanking movement that caught Vlad's force in a position from which withdrawal was not possible. The two explanations are not mutually exclusive. A military reversal and a betrayal in the same moment, reinforcing each other in the chaos of a winter engagement, where visibility was poor and the line between ally and enemy was exactly as reliable as it had always been in Wallachian politics. He was outnumbered, in the end, by the same forces that had always outnumbered him. Not Ottoman soldiers or Saxon merchants or Hungarian kings, though all of them had played their parts. The deeper outnumbering was simpler and older than any of those. A principality that could not sustain, for longer than a few years at a time, the kind of rule he imposed on it. A nobility that would accept terror as an organizing principle only for as long as the alternative seemed worse. A geography that required cooperation with the very powers he had spent his reign refusing to fully accommodate. He had known all of this. He had known it from the beginning. And he had proceeded anyway, with the full awareness of a man who had decided that proceeding was preferable to the alternative, whatever the alternative turned out to be. The forest was the same temperature it had always been in winter. The cold came down from the Carpathians the way it always came, indifferent to what was happening on the roads below. The trees held their snow the way they always held it, without preference, without the capacity for the kind of distinction that would have allowed them to treat this particular winter differently from any other. Something was ending on the road near Bucharest. The forest noted it the way it noted everything, by continuing. The body was found, or it was not found, depending on which account you trust. The Ottoman sources say it was found quickly, identified, separated from the rest of the dead, with a care that suggested the identification mattered, and sent south to Constantinople as proof of something the empire needed to prove to itself as much as to anyone else. The Wallachian sources say very little, which is consistent with what Wallachian sources always said about events that required a careful relationship with whoever came next. The Hungarian sources are frustratingly brief. A note in the correspondence of Matthias Corvinus that reads less like the record of a significant event and more like the closing of an administrative file that had been open for longer than anyone found comfortable. The man who had been useful was no longer useful. The entry was closed. What the sources agree on is the head. Mehmed received it in Constantinople and had it displayed. The specific form of display is not described in terms that allow a precise reconstruction, but the purpose was clear. This was communication, in the same register that Vlad himself had always used. A message sent not in words, but in objects, to an audience that needed to see rather than read. The message was simple: it is over. The problem that had occupied the empire's northern border for 15 years, that had turned an army around outside an abandoned capital, that had sent ambassadors back to Constantinople with iron through their skulls, that problem was resolved. The display said so. The empire moved on to its next problem, of which there were many. It always had many. The monks at Snagov received something, a body, or what remained of one, or perhaps only the instruction to pray for a soul whose physical location had become, for reasons that were not explained to them, a matter requiring discretion. They prayed. They maintained the grave, or the space where the grave was said to be. They answered the question, when it was asked, in the way that institutions answer questions when the full truth is either unknown or inadvisable, with enough of an answer to satisfy the immediate inquiry, and no more. For centuries this was sufficient. Then the excavations came, and the emptiness was documented, and the question became permanent in a way that the monks' careful management had always hoped to avoid. Wallachia moved on with the pragmatic speed of a place that had always moved on quickly. A new prince was installed, Ottoman-backed, manageable, the kind of ruler that the principality's geography almost inevitably produced when left to find its own equilibrium. The roads adjusted. The markets adjusted. The boyars who had survived 3 reigns of Vlad and everything in between made their calculations about the new administration and adjusted those too. The golden cup, if it had ever existed, was gone. The stakes outside Targovishte had long since rotted back into the earth they had been driven into. The plain was simply a plain again. The city was simply a city. The evidence of what had happened there was available only to the ground itself, which kept its record in a language that the living rarely think to read until they are no longer living. In Brasov, the Saxon merchants who had written the most vivid accounts of Vlad's violence were already moving on to other concerns. Trade disputes with the new administration, the shifting pattern of Ottoman tariffs, the perpetual negotiation of commercial access to a principality that would always need what they sold and always resent needing it. The pamphlets they had helped produce were circulating independently now, generating their own momentum in markets that had no connection to the original commercial grievance that had partly motivated them. The Saxons had wanted, among other things, to damage Vlad's reputation with the powers that might otherwise support him. They had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. The reputation they had damaged was now attached to something that no longer existed, a living man with a political situation that required management. What remained was the image, free of its original purpose, available for whatever purpose the next audience required. The Ottoman Empire, having displayed the head and closed the file, found that the name kept surfacing anyway. In folk accounts from the Wallachian and Bulgarian territories under their control, the figure of Kazakli Bey, the Impaler Lord, which is what the Ottomans had called him, persisted in a form that was neither entirely historical nor entirely fictional. He appeared in stories told to children in the specific register of stories, told to children about things that are dangerous, not to frighten them exactly, but to install in them a relationship with fear that acknowledged its reality while placing it at a manageable distance. He was the thing that came from the forest. He was the consequence of specific kinds of wrongdoing. He was, in the folk tradition of the territories he had fought over, a figure of warning rather than history, someone who had passed from the category of event into the category of lesson. The lesson varied depending on who was telling it and who was listening. The figure remained consistent. This is the oldest form of the myth, older than the pamphlets, older than Stoker, older than any of the elaborations that the centuries added. A figure preserved in oral tradition, because the communities that preserved it had experienced something that required preservation in a form more durable than written record. Something that needed to be carried forward, not as fact, but as feeling, as the residue of an encounter with a kind of power that the ordinary categories of human experience did not adequately describe. The feeling outlasted the fact. It always does. Facts require maintenance, archives, scholars, the sustained institutional attention of people who have decided that accuracy matters. Feelings require only transmission, one person telling another in the dark that something happened here once that you should know about, that the forest remembers, that the ground holds what the documents have lost. That some things do not end cleanly, regardless of what the official record says about heads displayed in Constantinople and files administratively closed. The Argeș River runs the same direction it has always run. The Carpathians hold the same cold. The passes are the same passes, paved now, lit at intervals, but fundamentally the same geometry of rock and elevation that has always made this part of the world legible, only to those willing to move through it slowly enough to understand what it is saying. The forest is saying something. It has always been saying something. The question is only whether there is anyone left who is patient enough to listen. 500 years is long enough for a man to become a country. Not a real country, not borders and currency, and a seat at whatever table the powerful nations of the era are using to negotiate their arrangements. A country in the older sense. A territory of the imagination that people visit without traveling, that exists most completely in the minds of people who have never been within 1,000 miles of the Carpathians and could not locate Wallachia on a map if their lives depended on it. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, ruler of a principality that most of his contemporaries considered a backwater, died in unclear circumstances in the winter of 1476 or 1477. Count Dracula, lord of an imaginary castle in a region he never ruled, has been continuously alive ever since. The distance between those two figures is the distance between history and myth. And that distance, it turns out, is not a failure of accuracy. It is a feature of how human memory works, how it selects over time the version of events that carries the most emotional weight and discards the rest, not because the rest is unimportant, but because memory, unlike archives, is not interested in completeness. It is interested in survival, in carrying forward, across generations and languages and technological revolutions, the essential residue of an encounter with something that exceeded the ordinary categories of human experience. The residue of Vlad, the thing that survived the pamphlets and the prison and the centuries and Stoker and Lugosi and every Halloween costume ever made in his approximate image, is something very specific. It is the figure of a will that will not be contained. That is what persists. Not the impalement, not the terror, not the specific political and military context that produced both. Those are the facts, and facts, as noted, require maintenance to survive. What survives without maintenance is the feeling of an encounter with someone who had decided, at some point that no document records, that the limits other people accepted were not limits that applied to him. That the gap between what was possible and what was permitted could be crossed, at sufficient cost, and that the cost was worth paying. This feeling attached itself to a name. The name traveled, and wherever it arrived, it found an audience that recognized the feeling, because the feeling is one that human beings have always had about certain kinds of people. The awe and the horror and the fascination that attach to figures who demonstrate, at whatever scale and at whatever cost, that the boundaries of the possible are not where most of us assume they are. Romania has been living with this for 5 centuries. The country that eventually emerged from the territories Vlad fought over, through Ottoman occupation, through Habsburg influence, through the slow and contested process of national formation that characterized the 19th century in this part of Europe, carries his name in its tourist brochures and its gift shops, and its complicated national conversation about what he means. Hero or monster, defender or tyrant, the man who held the line against Mehmed II, or the man who built a forest of stakes outside his own capital. The answer, of course, is that these are not alternatives. They are the same man, in the same moment, making the same choices. The question of which description applies depends entirely on where you are standing when you ask it. Inside the principality or outside it. On the road that is now safe or on the stake that made it so. In the Ottoman camp looking north or in the Wallachian mountains looking south. The view changes everything. The man does not. The historians who have spent careers on this question, and there are many of them, working in Romanian and Hungarian and Turkish and German and English, drawing on sources that do not always agree on basic facts, let alone interpretations, have not resolved it. They have not resolved it because it cannot be resolved, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the question itself is not the kind that resolves. It is the kind that opens. Each serious engagement with the historical Vlad produces not a verdict, but an expansion, a more detailed map of the territory between the man and the myth, a clearer picture of the specific pressures and choices and circumstances that produce someone whose name is still spoken 5 centuries after his death in a context he could not have imagined and would not have recognized. The map gets more detailed. The territory remains what it always was. Complex beyond resolution. Resistant to the simplifications that both the myth and the counter-myth require. The winter in the Carpathians comes early and stays late. This has not changed. The passes that Vlad rode through, fleeing, returning, fleeing again, returning again, are the same passes, shaped by the same geology, exposed to the same weather that has been moving through them since before any human being thought to name them. The cold that comes down from the high ground in October is the cold that came down in 1476, in 1462, in 1448. In the winter, a boy was taken south to the Ottoman court and did not look back at the mountains he was leaving. Or perhaps he did look back. The sources do not say. They are silent on the inner life of an 11-year-old crossing the Carpathians in the wrong direction, not yet knowing what he was being made into, not yet knowing that the making would take years and produce something the mountains themselves would eventually have reason to remember. The forest watched him go. The forest watched him come back. The forest watched everything that followed, the feast and the stakes and the night raid and the army that turned around, and the prison and the release, and the winter engagement on the road near Bucharest, where something happened that the sources cannot agree on, and the ground has not forgotten. The forest is still watching. It has nowhere else to be. It has no investment in which version of the story turns out to be true. It holds all the versions simultaneously, in the patient, indifferent way of things that have been present for all of it, and will be present for whatever comes next. The trees do not choose between the hero and the monster. They simply grew through the period when the distinction mattered, and continued growing after it stopped mattering, and will continue still. This is what the archive holds. Not a verdict. Not a resolution. The weight of a specific history in a specific place. The cold and the mountains and the river running below the ruined castle and the plain outside the abandoned capital, where the stake stood once and the ground remembers, and the birds eventually came back. They always come back. That is the one thing that is certain. Everything else remains exactly as it has always been, open, unresolved, waiting for someone patient enough to sit with it without demanding that it close. The road from Targovishte is quiet at this hour. It has always been quiet at this hour, before the light comes over the eastern ridge of the Carpathians, before the villages along the valley begin their day, before the ordinary sounds of ordinary life fill the space that the night leaves behind. In the quiet, if you are patient enough to stand in it without reaching for something to fill it with, you can feel the weight of the ground beneath you. Not metaphorically. Actually, the specific density of soil that has absorbed 5 centuries of weather and whatever else the centuries brought through here, pressed down by the same gravity that presses everything, holding its record in the only language available to it. Silence and weight. The two things that outlast everything else. Vlad III ruled Wallachia for a total of perhaps 7 years. In those 7 years, he executed somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 people. The range is that wide because the sources are that unreliable, and because the truth, wherever it sits within that range, is in some sense less important than the fact that no serious historian disputes the lower bound. 40,000 is not a rounding error. It is not a propaganda figure invented by Saxon merchants with commercial grievances. It is the conservative estimate, the number you arrive at if you discount everything that cannot be independently verified and count only what multiple sources confirm from multiple directions. 40,000 people in a principality whose total population was probably somewhere between 500,000 and 1,000,000 in 7 years. The mathematics do not require elaboration. They require only acknowledgement. And yet the roads were safe. And yet the Ottoman army turned around. And yet the name has survived 500 years and shows no sign of fading. These things are all true simultaneously. They do not resolve each other. They do not cancel each other out. They sit together in the historical record with the uncomfortable proximity of facts that refuse to arrange themselves into a conclusion that anyone can feel entirely settled about. This is not a failure of the record. It is the record. It is what history actually looks like when you get close enough to it to see the texture rather than the outline. The outline is what the myth preserved. The texture is what the archive holds. And the texture is this: a man of genuine military intelligence and genuine political sophistication, operating in circumstances that offered no good options, making choices that were his own in the specific sense that he made them more completely and more extremely than the circumstances strictly required. A man shaped by captivity into something that captivity cannot entirely explain. A man who understood fear as a language and spoke it with a fluency that has not been matched, in that particular dialect, by anyone before or since. A man who looked at the gap between what was permitted and what was possible and crossed it repeatedly without apparent hesitation, and paid a price for crossing it that he seems to have considered acceptable from the beginning. Whether he was right, whether the price was worth the outcome, whether the outcome was worth the price, is a question that history cannot answer, because history does not answer that kind of question. It only asks it. The light is coming over the eastern ridge now. The specific quality of early light in the Carpathians, the way it arrives slowly, feeling its way down the slopes before it reaches the valley floor, the way it turns the forest from a single dark mass into individual trees, each one distinct, each one holding its particular shape against the brightening sky. This has not changed. It was this light that came over these mountains on the morning after the night raid into Mehmed's camp. It was this light that fell on the plain outside Targovishte when the Ottoman advance guard stopped and looked at what had been built for them to find. It was this light, or the absence of it, that surrounded a winter engagement on a road near Bucharest, where something ended that the documents cannot fully describe. The light does not know any of this. It arrives the same way regardless. Patient, indifferent, illuminating everything equally, without distinguishing between what deserves the light and what would prefer to remain in the dark. The forest is distinct now, tree by tree, as the light finds it. The crows that left the road from Targovishte 3 days before the ambassadors arrived have long since returned. Not those specific crows, obviously, but their descendants, occupying the same trees, following the same routes, living and dying in the same forest without any awareness of what the forest witnessed or what it holds. The forest holds it anyway. That is what forests do. They hold what passes through them without being asked to, without choosing to, without the capacity to do otherwise. The holding is simply what they are. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, the kind that does not release you cleanly when it ends, that leaves something behind in the room after the voice stops, then the archive has done what it came to do. Leave your suggestion in the comments below. The next silence is already waiting to be broken. The archive is listening. The road from Targovishte was quiet when this began. It is quiet now. The ground holds what it holds. The mountains hold what they hold. And somewhere in the specific weight of this particular silence, in the space between what the documents confirm and what the documents cannot reach, a prince who was never entirely what his enemies said he was, and never entirely what his defenders claimed, who was made by his circumstances and exceeded them and was destroyed by them and outlasted them, continues to exist in the only form available to the dead. As a question. Open. Unanswered. Waiting, with the patience he always had, for someone willing to sit with it long enough to feel its full weight. The forest is watching. It always has been.